SEP FanFic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 31. The Passenger Seat. October 7th, 2011. Fatigue riddled Hermione's very being. Beyond mental or physical, it was the sort of exhaustion that tugged at her eyelids, leaned on her heart, and made every movement heavy until proper solace was found. Eventually, she always stopped fighting, closed her eyes, and let herself rest. No matter where she nodded off, the sofa, a chair, or while sunning with Scorpius on cool days with warming charms, Hermione always woke in a bed with the ever-present ache in her chest, covered in Draco's blanket and completely disoriented, but not always alone. Sometimes Andromeda or Pansy was there, or Susan, or Padma on days when she slept too long. But today, Scorpius stood next to her bed, with everything except his face draped in the blanket he now called his. After her coughing fit, the remnant of lung damage that would take time to heal, he shuffled to the edge, dragging the cotton blanket along. She wondered how long he'd been there, but she never asked, only lifted the covers in invitation. He abandoned his blanket and joined her while Hermione debated a second nap after he settled on her pillow, blinking at her. With her good hand, she brushed soft hair from his forehead. Her touch was feather-light, lingering on his brow. "Did you have fun in the garden with your grandmother and Mr. Neville?" Scorpius dimpled just a bit. He'd enjoyed himself. "Did you say hello to the plants for me?" "Yes." The lack of hesitation in his single-word response meant he was in what Hermione affectionately thought of as his talking mood, which was becoming rather normal. Normal after time with the Potters when his cheeks were ruddy from running after a toy snitch. Normal after his father read each note Scorpius pulled from his pocket, some old, one new, but each meaningful. Normal after a day in the garden pulling weeds or digging up potatoes, which was another new normal for him. The habit had started one day when Narcissa excused herself to meet Neville. Scorpius had perked and asked with his hands to go. They had all been surprised, but Draco agreed so long as Catherine accompanied them, and he'd gone each day since. While Neville and gardening had been part of his initial draw, perhaps it was now driven by the promise of one-on-one time with his grandmother in a place he found peace. The change between Narcissa and Scorpius was tenuous, but evident. Narcissa smiled more and seemed settled around him, relaxed even. And that morning, Scorpius, after much hesitation, had surprised them all when he'd approached his grandmother after tying his own shoes unassisted for the first time. He was proud of his accomplishment, and so was Narcissa. She told him so, possibly even for the first time, and the way he'd stared at her, smile fading slightly, turning earnest, meant he'd believed her. It was the moment Hermione released her worries of him retreating back into himself, but also the moment she truly thought about resilience, of a child, of people, of herself. Scorpius still hadn't spoken to another adult, nor was he ready. He'd whispered a confession before bed last night that he wanted to, and Hermione assured him that when he was ready, everyone would listen. For now, she worked on his confidence during their quiet talks, and eased his nerves by praising each verbal milestone. Draco remained steadfast in earning his son's trust, while Narcissa remained silent on the matter altogether. She seemed at ease with the bond they were forming. Scorpius was communicative in private, controlled spaces with little to no chance for interruption. Simple, single-word comments were his favorite. But 3 days ago, he'd paced his dad's office for 20 minutes on the edge of tears until Draco carefully excused himself. Scorpius had waited just a bit longer before pulling himself together to awkwardly ask for a hug and a story. They both froze. Before he could flee, she'd agreed to his first request, holding him close and murmuring into his hair that he never had to ask. The second request was honored a few minutes later, when he cuddled at her side while Hermione told a story about the sun falling in love with the unfreeable moon who only was visible in the fleeting moments of dawn and dusk. Draco had returned for the beginning of the tale and stayed throughout. "Are you the sun?" he asked hours later when they were alone. His hand traveled a familiar course up and down her back while she battled between grounding herself and flying away. "Or are you the moon?" "Neither. I'm Earth." Too tired to do anything more, Hermione closed her eyes and relaxed with the rhythm of his heart in her ear, and the slow rise and fall of his chest under the palm of her aching hand. Who are you? The moon. Untouchable to the lonely sun, but locked in an orbital dance with Earth. Held at arm's length by gravity. Hermione still thought about his response even now while looking at his son. Scorpius booped her on the nose, and they laughed together until it faded into sighs. Do you want to play the name game? Blue eyes brightened. It was a game Hermione had started just the week before to figure out what he called everything, and get him comfortable with answering small questions. Her smile grew when he'd scooted closer, waiting patiently for her to begin. What do you call Albus? Scorpius wore an expression that was very Draco. Albus? Okay, that was a silly one. She laughed when he visibly agreed. Let's see. What do you call the plants in your dad's office? He didn't hesitate, but very slowly answered. Granger. What? Hermione turned her head and coughed more from surprise than anything. Why that name? Scorpius' shrug was as childlike as he sometimes was not. Daddy says it. Oh. Now Hermione was curious. Your dad calls all the plants Granger? Yes. It must have sounded ridiculous to Scorpius because he giggled. Hermione felt warm, flushed even, from imagining Draco speaking to the plants. In her head he sounded every bit as posh as he was, and looked irritated while pretending not to be under the watch of his son's eagle eye. Quintessential Draco Malfoy. Scorpius remained relaxed next to her, which was good, because she'd started the name game to build up to an important conversation that needed to be had about a certain name. And your name for me is Mum? The little boy's eyes were open and earnest, his cheeks pink, and his nerves visibly building before he nodded slowly. Yes. Is that what you want? If at all possible, Scorpius blushed harder. His answer came out in a squeak. Yes. Like your mum? No. His face shifted to an expression so sad it made Hermione ache for him. With him. Mummy was sick. She was. Hermione had to clear her throat. I never met her, but I do know a few things. She loves you and misses you. She wishes she were still here. I know. Scorpius looked a little sad, but nowhere near as morose as he had been. Daddy said so. Her heart lurched. Draco had kept his promise. Whatever you want to know about your mother. Does that make you feel better, when he tells you about your mummy? He nodded slowly. A knock on the door ended the conversation before either was ready. Come in. It was Catherine. Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Malfoy stepped out for a minute to retrieve documents from the Potters and wanted to make certain you were awake in time for therapy. I am. Zippy has lunch ready for you. It took several minutes for her and Scorpius to make it downstairs. He led the way, but looked back after each step to make certain she was all right. Hermione still moved slowly. Her body was sore from both exercise and physical therapy, heavy with residual sleep, and ached from the cough that left her chest burning. By the time she was safely on the landing, Draco emerged from the flue with a stack of parchments. And a visitor. Albus. They made an incongruous sight. Draco was put together in all black, and Albus was messy in a red jumper and jeans with what looked like a fresh hole in the knee. His hair was an absolute mess, and his hands were probably sticky, given the way Draco frowned at his own hand when he let Albus go. Ever careful, Scorpius didn't walk over until he made eye contact with Hermione. I'm fine. Go on and say hi. Albus signed a greeting slowly and blushed when Scorpius fixed his fingers to show him the right way to ask if he wanted to paint. He tried it again, and then there were two boys side by side peering up at the long-suffering Draco. Hermione approached slowly. I didn't know you were bringing Albus over. The comment made the boy in question grin widen, carefree and pure, and she could see that his new tooth was nearly filled in. Mr. Draco said I could come play. I did not. But I'm here now. The way Draco's face fell when the validity of Albus's logic dawned on him made Hermione smother her laugh with a cough. A tiny one escaped when his son's best friend continued by proudly declaring, Mr. Draco says I'm his least favorite Potter, so that means he likes me. Draco opened his mouth to correct him, but it was very clear that there was no arguing with the smiling child. Upon realizing this, he pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled. Albus did the same in a playful yet mocking way. and Scorpius giggled so hard that Draco softened ever so slightly. "Your dad is the funniest!" The comment made both Malfoys exchange looks. Scorpius tilted his head in question, almost as if he were trying to figure out if Albus's statement was true or false. But then his smile morphed slowly into something content. He stepped closer to his father, who had reduced himself to their height, and signed a question. "Can we paint, please?" Yes, Draco signed the answer too, which demonstrated just how much progress they had made in communication. "Find Catherine to help set up your canvases." Albus all but dragged his friend towards the stairs. Scorpius looked back twice before he stopped and turned back to his father, who answered before his question could even be signed. "I'll hang it on the wall." The promise sent Scorpius off with a pep in his step. Hermione's eyebrow was already arched when his attention shifted to her. "What is it?" "Nothing." She offered a smile only for him and shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling a bit tired, but alert enough to ignore it for now. "I wonder if you'll run out of space for Scorpius's artwork." "I'll make room." Hermione had no doubt he would. "You and Al are hilarious." "He's annoying." Draco rolled his eyes. "I dare say worse than his father." "Yet you bring him over every day." "If you must know, Granger, he follows me around like a shadow, constantly asking to come over until I say yes. Of course his parents find my disdain humorous." So did she. Hermione laughed at the visual while Draco continued to scowl even after she stopped. "Admit it, you secretly like having him around." Draco did not admit anything. Refused to, in fact. He subtly sulked before placing the parchments on the table and drawing her closer, but not with words. The pull to his side only took the curl of one finger and the intensity of watchful eyes that monitored each step. Hermione moved close enough to touch, something she only barely stopped herself from doing, while simultaneously wondering if Draco would soon excuse himself because he glanced at his watch. "Almost time for your potions." "I know." Hermione gestured to the vials next to the steaming bowl of soup on the table waiting for her. "Lunch first, therapy in half an hour, physical therapy at 2. "I'm aware." "What are you doing this afternoon?" Draco remained awfully busy for someone on administrative leave, always in closed-door meetings and working late into the night after putting Scorpius to bed. Hermione tried to poke and prod him for information or clues about what he was doing, but the worst thing about Draco was that he wasn't only stubborn, he was methodical and had planned for each of her attempts to suss out details. He held steady with the same response each time, today included. "We'll talk later." Cryptic but almost normal. The corners of her mouth flattened as she started to huff and back away, but Draco didn't let her. He pulled her closer and wound his arms around her, resting his chin on the crown of her head. Something uncoiled in her, and the warmth of sensation set her on edge. "Are you joining me?" Her question was purposely low, comfortably unsettled, just like her. "Do you want me to?" He never let her answer. More specifically, what do you need? This was the same question Draco gruffly asked before each therapy appointment, physical or otherwise. Most of the time, Hermione had no response, but today she placed her fist on his chest and slowly uncurled her fingers. The effort was evident in her sharp hiss of pain as she observed her trembling hand. Like each attempt before, worry struck like lightning, quick and dangerous. "I'm restless, and therapy makes it worse, no matter how much I know I need it." Confessions like these rubbed her raw. It was too difficult to look at him in the eye, so she spoke to his chest. "I wouldn't mind the distraction beforehand." Draco said nothing else as he led the way to the table. Hermione took her potions and slowly ate soup, while he updated her on the experimental potion he tried to work on in what little spare time he could find. Conversation stimulated her stagnant mind. Harry's arrival marked the end of lunch and the rare snatch of time she saw him during the day. "Secret meeting?" "Won't be one for long." Draco leaned over until his mouth hovered next to her ear. A finger curved under her chin, turning her head towards him. "Focus on therapy. I'm handling the rest." Draco didn't kiss her, but her heart raced regardless. Therapy remained a mystery to Hermione. She began each appointment not knowing the outcome or how she would feel. The therapist also seemed out of her element in the unconventional location of their appointment. Due to security needs, the small sitting room off the main area had been converted into a meeting space. To ease them both, they began with conversational platitudes. The weather, the long week, the Quidditch match between Bulgaria and Spain neither cared about. Hermione tried to drag it out for the entire session, but her therapist gave her a knowing look over the rim of her glasses, a silent reminder that she knew every conversation avoidance tactic. Though Hermione hadn't been her regular patient in years, her habits and tendencies were memorable. "What would you like to discuss today?" It was the worst question in existence, and entirely to blame for Hermione's difficulty in setting the course of a therapy session she was supposed to steer. Each attempt to divert to the point of these sessions, coping with the trauma of nearly dying and talking about the attack itself, brought her face to face with one of her biggest problems, her mother. Or perhaps how easy it was to link a traumatic event to a relationship that had been in a state of crisis for years. One second, Hermione was dreading the session, and the next she was spilling her frustrations and realizing her own faults in it all. The chime that ended the session left her with a spinning head and hurting heart as she stared into the face of the assignment she had yet to complete. "Find true calm." Her therapist closed her book. "Have you worked on that yet, Hermione?" No, she hadn't. "I'm still looking." Hermione usually found it in moments with people, familiar activities, and the quiet before bed. But things were different. Tranquility was more elusive now than ever before, and serenity seemed impossible to achieve. As days passed, and thoughts she'd set aside and buried were unearthed, her consciousness turned into an inexhaustible and restless minefield. She realized she was living a precedent. Not even after her seizure had she truly stopped like now. Back then, Hermione had bought a house and created a garden to regain her sense of self. Her first recovery had involved combining optimism for the future with acceptance of the past. There had always been something to tend to during the lulls. But now everything, even Draco, was in constant motion, revolving around her while she remained stagnant. Hermione had never been more frustrated in her life. It crawled up her spine, tightening that knot between her shoulders, unable to shake it, unable to put it out. The feeling spread and very little could deter it. Her assignment was more like a punishment. By the time she had her appointment with Susan later that afternoon, it felt as though the walls were closing in on her. When Hermione felt the first cramp, after pushing through a bout of fatigue during an exercise, she dropped to her knees. Susan was right there, guiding her to sit down and slowly massaging the muscle. "You seem off today, more than yesterday." Susan's approach to therapy was a mix of everything: exercises, stretches, goals, assignments, potions, and charms. Daily sessions were spent regaining her strength. Physically, there was nothing wrong. The muscles had been regrown, the bones fixed, and the skin mended. But her body was weak and easy to cramp. Her brain remained detached, unable to make the connection that she was no longer broken. It struggled to remember that she was whole, alive. "I'm fine." The look Susan gave was reminiscent of ones they all reserved for Lisa. "I've seen the inside of your leg and put your fingers in my pocket for safekeeping. Try again." When put like that, "I'm frustrated." The statement left Hermione feeling unmoored with nothing to reach for. "I'm sick of the fatigue and the pain. I'm completely out of my element, and I feel like a stranger in my own skin. I've got little to no control over—" "You've been through significant trauma." Susan stopped her before frustration tipped into tears. "I understand how you feel. It's valid. But at the same time, you could have died. That's not something you can easily move on from." "I know." It was always a sobering thought. "There's a lot going on, even if no one talks to me about it. I'm just not used to being useless." "You're not useless. You're recovering, even if you're pushing yourself." Her friend's brown eyes narrowed into a glare. "Don't think I don't know how much time you spend worrying about the state of your hands or pushing yourself to speed up your recovery." She squinted. "Who told you?" "I don't need a specific account to know. It's who you are." Susan glanced at the door. "But during his session, Malfoy did allude to the fact that you started joining him for water exercise. Hydrotherapy is good for the muscles without the strain and it has nothing to do with a certain man keeping you company, right?" Susan snorted loudly at her affronted look and accompanying blush. "I'm just giving you a hard time. Hydrotherapy is good, and we would be there now, but I don't swim. As aggressive as I am with therapy, I don't want you to overdo it either. 15 minutes of water exercises and 15 minutes of exercises in here maximum, not a half hour of each. Susan folded her legs and offered her hand. Hermione knew what to do, placing her newly unbandaged wrist into her friend's palm. The bruises were gone, but her tremor was noticeable, as was her inability to hold any sort of weight. Once again, Hermione spread her fingers. Even with potions in her system, the pain hadn't fully abated, and neither had her fear of permanent nerve damage. Magic could heal a lot of broken things, but some damage could not be undone. I still believe it's psychosomatic. Susan touched the tips of each finger, focusing on their small, involuntary twitches. Are you doing the exercises I assigned? Yes. With Draco's help. Each morning before Scorpius came down for breakfast. Sometimes she did them alone, but frustration always stopped her efforts, leaving her feeling overstretched and overwhelmed, sitting in the corner and telling herself to breathe. Can you feel this? Susan began bending each finger slowly, then tilting her wrist. Hermione took deep breaths to stop herself from feeling dizzy. Talk to me and focus on what I'm doing, or you're going to panic and I'm going to have to shove a calming draught down your throat. Hermione's following chuckle was ragged. It took time to gather her thoughts. I feel it. Increasing sensation did wonders for her nerves, but the tremor returned and conquered. The pinch of pain was jagged as it sliced up her forearm and into her elbow. Susan only observed. Hermione didn't like the sound of that. What is it? It's too soon to say for certain if it's permanent. Susan summoned the sling Hermione hated wearing and helped her into it. Keep this on for the rest of the day. Remember what I said about the exercises. Don't overdo it. You can take an invigoration draft when you leave, but please allow yourself to rest. The fatigue leaves me no option. Hermione was a little irritated by the simple fact that her arm felt better the instant the sling was in place. Overall, there's not much I can do. I can't even read for very long because I get headaches and feel nauseous. For the 100th time, you're doing too much. Susan's exhale sounded too much like Draco's about Albus. Long-suffering. When was the last time you went outside? And I don't mean in the garden. Security. They had always been around, but now the aura presence in the area had increased. Hermione heard a small fraction of the whispers, paid attention to the clues gathered from those around her, and managed to get 2 bits of information from the sealed trap known as Draco Malfoy. He declined 12 requests for interviews about finding her, and his internal hearing was only 2 hours before her summons on Monday to turn over her memories. The inevitable had been pushed back as long as possible. Besides, I can't use any form of magical transportation. I think you need a change of scenery. Might help you find the calm you're supposed to be looking for. Susan got to her feet and helped her up, keeping Hermione steady when she swayed. Tuesday? She raised a dark eyebrow. Or would you both like to keep ignoring the elephant in the room and continue separate sessions? The alternative would save me a lot of time keeping Malfoy updated. What? Hermione didn't know he'd been asking. Look, I won't say my opinion of him has entirely shifted, but... She gave a lazy, one-shouldered shrug. He's not what I thought. High praise from Susan, who voiced so few of her own opinions. Except about Lisa. Draco's been... Hermione found it difficult to put his behavior into words. Draco was both reassuring and critical, distant but attached in odd ways she was beginning to find comfortable. He never hovered, only listened and observed indirectly. Whatever she needed appeared without question, which warred with her independent spirit and ideology. But there was a tiny part of Hermione that didn't allow her to outright deny the truth. She didn't exactly mind it. He supported you, and he still does, but he's also a bloody tyrant. Susan squeezed her hands into fists as if she were actively trying not to seek Draco out to strangle him herself. But then she huffed a laugh and completed her visual assessment. Hate to say it, but it's what you need while you recover. Probably beyond, too. Hermione rolled her shoulder as words stacked on top of all of her unearthing thoughts. Draco doesn't talk about finding me, or the week I was unconscious. In fact, he actively avoided each attempt and even left the room a few times until she finally gave up, at least for now. Nobody really does. Susan fixed her ponytail and made Hermione sit in a chair. She paced a bit before finally speaking. I might joke, But I hope you understand how difficult it was to see you like that." Hermione could tell she was choosing her words wisely. "I know you want to know everything, because it'll make you feel in control. But we're still reeling. We'd just gotten Padma stable when Malfoy appeared with you. Your pulse was so weak we couldn't find one at first, not even through magical means. As soon as we got your airway clear and your vitals stable, the hallucination started and no one so much as exhaled until the poison was out of your system. Least of all Malfoy." The explanation left her uneasy enough to understand Draco's reluctance. "I will say Malfoy was the only one who knew everything you kept up with. He gave orders and didn't accept arguments. Naturally, Harry had to break things up a few times between him and Ron." Hermione could only imagine how that went. "I don't think anyone knew you two were together." "We're not?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat as another topic rose from the place it had been buried in her mind. "I mean, we're in this in-between phase where a lot of things aren't spoken or official, and the time isn't right. He's been careful. Not to touch her too much or too tight. Not to look too closely at what would likely be permanent scars after the first night. Most of the bruises were beginning to fade, cuts and wounds were healing, but not the ones around her neck. Those were slow to heal for unknown reasons, but Draco remained undeterred, rubbing salve on them each night and monitoring the progress when she couldn't, when it became a struggle to do so. Hermione appreciated the quiet sentiment, the steadiness and strength. She didn't have to ask for his help, or the glamour when she was around Scorpius. Susan let it down to look at the true state of her wounds. She made Hermione stand again in order to evaluate her right side, all scarred skin and irritated flesh. "This is getting worse. Theo thinks it's a reaction to the potion we used to grow your skin. I'll look for options to help. How does it feel?" "It used to only itch, but now it hurts when the pain potion wears off." Hermione turned her head and coughed. It was dry and burned her chest, but she pushed through. "The salve Draco uses helps temporarily, but my skin still feels strange. I know exactly which bits were grown. It's the same with my leg. I get phantom pains." They were like nightmares, sudden and unexpected. "We're still looking for a solution, but for now, this weekend your assignment for me is to relax. No exercises in the pool or in this room. Take some time to reorient. How's therapy going?" Hermione gave Susan a look which made her friend hold both her hands up in surrender. "Touchy subject, I get it. Padma gives me the same look when I ask." She pulled down Hermione's shirt. "I told Malfoy about your need for a free weekend during our last session, because I know how you are." The sulking look made Susan laugh until she sobered. "Malfoy's a terror to deal with because of his inability to mince words, the way he looks and tends to talk down to people, and his refusal to compromise on certain things. With that being said, when you were hallucinating and incoherent, he took you seriously. He talked to you like you could hear him." Hermione coughed and looked down. "I'm certain I could." Susan's sharp inhale before they exchanged looks spoke volume. "Bits of things. Nothing I can recall, except Draco telling me to drink." The rest was harder to speak on. The flashes she could remember were memories and hallucinations that blended and bent reality until she didn't know if she was dreaming or awake. But the timer went off before anything else could be said, and while Susan packed up, Hermione couldn't help but think about what her friend had gone through. "I hope you're taking care of yourself, too." The comment made the witch turn her head and snort. "I have better coping mechanisms than you lot. I took yoga and meditation seriously, unlike you." The pointed look given was accompanied by a small gesture towards the mat they'd started the lesson on. Hermione had failed 2 minutes in, a record. "If you must know, I harass the blokes in my fencing class and serve as a guinea pig to Hannah, who wants to learn how to brew beer. Seeing you recover helps, but I have a lot of outlets. Don't worry about me. I'm fine." Her eyes traveled to the door. "Pretty sure Narcissa Malfoy is out there pretending she's not waiting for you." Susan was right. "Miss Bones? Miss Granger?" "Narcissa?" The witch made a gesture, and before following, Hermione looked back as her friend waved while barely suppressing her amusement. Sax met them at the stairs, and they went up. Hermione was incapable of ignoring Narcissa's eyes on her back, or the quiet encouragement from Sax. The invigoration draft Sax produced when they reached the top was a surprise. Hermione took it with little hesitation, feeling better instantly. It wouldn't last forever, but it would do for now. Narcissa excused herself with Sax while Hermione walked on alone. Padma was waiting for her in the living room, dressed casually with her hair pulled back. The only physical evidence of her injury emerged from Padma's hairline and stopped at her eyebrow, a scar surrounded by irritated skin. It was surprising to see it on display, because Padma usually hid it behind a strategic part of her hair. Hermione didn't ask, only greeted her with a one-armed hug that seemed to ground them both. Good, bad, or in between? Padma sighed. My mom and aunt sobbed loudly when the beautification charm didn't cover my scar. So, bad? In between. Padma shrugged. A slow smile played on her lips. Parvati started yelling at everyone long enough for me to slip out unnoticed. Tea outside? It was something they did daily, so long as the weather held. At first they just held hands in silence while Scorpius colored or took tentative steps towards trying to catch the toy snitch that had been collecting dust in a toy box, until Albus's reemergence in his life. But each day sparked more conversation that drifted from topic to topic. They learned more about each other than ever before as the bonds of their friendship tightened through the healing process. To Hermione's surprise, Scorpius enjoyed Padma's visits. Like everyone before, their first meeting was full of scrutiny and had nothing to do with the very noticeable scar, but rather a quiet awe because she'd commented about Mint standing straight unprompted. He'd offered his hand and she'd shaken it, not knowing just how big of a moment it was for him. They both smiled openly at each other. While unmemorable in the grand scheme of the day, the moment defined its significance after talking to Blaise, not because he'd mentioned it being her first smile since waking, but because of his palpable relief. Today the sun was out, the air was cool but not cold, and there was no breeze. It was the perfect day to sit at the table outside. When Padma excused herself to the loo, a coiffed and elegantly dressed Narcissa took her place for a few moments before her occupational therapy appointment. How are things with Charles? And you are supposed to be on medical leave, but things are fine. Narcissa made a face as if the stressed word was not welcomed in her vocabulary. I have not had an apparition incident since the changing of the wards, but the muscle tremors are increasing, if you must know. Hermione already did, the hand on her back earlier. The consistent habit of braiding her hair without asking. She'd felt each tremor for herself. I hear your summons is on Monday. By nature, the shift in conversation made Hermione suspicious. It is. There was a pause. Are you prepared? I am. It wasn't something she had spared much thought. Hermione wasn't unfamiliar with the process. Her memories had been taken during the trials after the war, and that had been a quick, painless ordeal. Who will escort you? Percy. A tilt of her head gave Narcissa's confusion away. Interesting. Why do you ask? Hermione shifted in her chair. For the same reason I braid your hair every day. Pretend not to wait for you to finish physical therapy, and do not speak on anything I have seen. I am trying something new. Hermione didn't have time to delve into the layers of meaning between Narcissa's words, because Harry stood at the door, waiting for her. I wonder what Mr. Potter wants. Hermione wondered too. There were too many people in Draco's office. Perhaps that was the reason he somehow looked both at ease, yet exasperated beyond words. But Hermione was drawn less to him and the vial of what looked like a memory in Percy's hand, and more to the new addition to the space. A table with a map that had tiny diamonds in various places, a few of which were moving and spinning. Percy, Harry, and to her surprise Hestia, were gathered around, comfortable in a space they had frequented so little, if ever in Hestia's case. Floating teacups and Harry's jacket thrown over the back of the sofa were indicative of the fact that he'd been there a while. Blaise and Padma were peering at the map and frowning like they couldn't comprehend it. This discussion needs to happen in another room, preferably out of my earshot. Hestia looked around at each of them. I'm not skilled at occlumency as Mr. Malfoy. The less I know, the better. Blaise stayed behind with Padma and Hestia, while Draco led the way to the office where Hermione had her therapy appointment earlier. Unconsciously, she took the chair Draco had pulled out for her, and felt him behind her still when Percy began explaining the situation. Harry thinks we should bring you into the fold of everything that's happened, and the developments in the investigation. I would prefer to wait until after your summons. However, with Draco as the deciding vote, I was overruled. Percy's eyes cut to the man behind her, then back. much to my surprise. But not to hers, when Hermione thought about it. Draco had promised in his own way. Okay, but first, why are Padma and Blaise in Draco's office? To be briefed. Percy adjusted the cuff of his green dress shirt before taking a seat and crossing his legs. Padma's summons went on as scheduled without incident, but yesterday, Cormac turned up at Blaise's office with investigators loyal to Tiberius. They attempted to interrogate him about the Restoration. Hermione was instantly annoyed. What does Blaise know about the Restoration? Other than its existence, nothing. Same with Padma. Rita has been working with us, as has Parvati. There were no secrets between the sisters or soon-to-be-married couple. Parvati has been gathering evidence on other Wizengamot members. It's hard to notice the corruption of others when Tiberius is in our faces, but it runs far deeper than just him. They would have to scorch the entire department from the inside out just to cleanse it. She looked from Percy to Harry, who seemed ready to speak. There's more. Harry scrubbed a hand over his face before scratching his chin, covered in the facial hair he hadn't bothered to shave. Your summons will likely take place privately. Frankly, I don't care who's there. Hermione folded her arms. With an official summons, I have no choice but to cooperate. I just want it to be over so I can leave as soon as possible. We want you to cooperate. Mostly. The inflection in Draco's voice made him sound as if he were joking, when he very much was not. At least, we want you to give the pretense of cooperation. What? She cut her eyes at Percy, who nodded. Now Hermione was intrigued. We've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out what you saw. Draco was obviously choosing his words carefully. Canvassing the scenes, viewing your memory, gathering evidence, and interrogating the captured Death Eaters, but we haven't been able to decipher anything useful or figure it out. I could have watched my memory. And subject yourself to repeatedly watching a traumatic event? Harry visibly blanched, looking as though he would rather face Voldemort again than let that happen. Not a chance! Draco stepped out from behind her and approached a bookshelf. None of us want the knowledge of the notes in Ministry hands, as it would put our work in jeopardy. We also don't want them to know where or what happened after Greyback took you. Not for certain, at least. Hestia knows enough to jump through bureaucratic hoops for manpower and resources, but she doesn't want to know more than that. Well, that explained her comment. How could I possibly get away with giving a false memory? If you were proficient in occlumency, you could edit the memory, but you're not. I could learn. Of course you would suggest learning something as complex as occlumency days before your inquiry. Draco gave a small, annoyed huff that was accompanied by a quick eye roll. I can't train you in your current condition, nor am I inclined to. I'd tear your mind apart with the slightest push. He had a fair point. The plan is to swap your memory for another's. Whose? Mine. How? Hermione's eyebrows rose sharply. You weren't there. No, I wasn't. There was a tinge of discomfort beneath the surface. However, I viewed your memory enough times to create a false copy. A look passed between them. Her breath caught, but Draco continued on unfazed. I know how to omit things, and the decrease in clarity of the memory can easily be explained by your mental state at the time. Draco waved his hand before she could launch into an inquiry of her own. Anyway, it's already been done. Yesterday, to be exact. Draco truly had been busy, but Hermione doubted that was the extent of it. There's also the media. Rita has been pressing for an exclusive interview. Harry shrugged when everyone looked at him. What? I know it seems minor, but the media talks about little else except Hermione. I'd rather not subject myself to an interview. Hermione looked down at her sling before placing a protective hand over it. I wasn't the only one there. I wasn't the only brave person. You're a war hero who took on a number of Death Eaters during an attack on St. Mungo's. Then you saved the life of a friend while injured, were kidnapped, and escaped on your own. Percy ignored the daggers being shot at him by Draco. I understand and agree with your decision, but perhaps a small update might suffice. You can do that, but nothing more. I mean it. The media is a circus. With that many witnesses, it didn't take long for stories to emerge. Harry looked over at Draco. We couldn't stop them. At first, criticism came down heavily on the Auror's office and task force, but then there were dozens of leaked documents about the Wizengamot not signing off on increased security measures, It's been chaotic at best for the minister's office and Tiberius. Chaotic enough for everyone to sign off on whatever we ask for without reading it. Percy looked nothing short of humored. He even signed off on the investigation into the notes, although it wasn't worded as such. The notes just need to be tracked down. Hermione's brow furrowed. How much more is there to it? All three men seemed to make a silent decision on who was going to deliver the news. Harry lost. We've wanted to keep you as uninvolved as possible. Percy was the runner-up. We're not even sure if it's going to work. Draco won. It already is working. Explain. Hermione held up her hand, feeling a familiar tickle in her throat that always came before a coughing fit. When it passed, she gestured for him to continue despite the tightness in her chest. I'm fine. Go on. He didn't appear to believe her, but did as requested. I told you there were a few active notes. We've been tracking them down, snatching the Death Eaters carrying them, and replacing them with auras using polyjuice. So far, they've fed us locations and information. That was smart. Using their tactics against them. Hermione almost smiled. Yes. We've accounted for all the notes we could, Harry added. What about Greyback? They all knew. The auras we have in there say they're all furious at Greyback, but won't exterminate him because he's valuable and powerful. Harry shifted from right to left. He's been healed of the curse, but not completely. They don't know how, but they think his lycanthropy is keeping him alive. Best question. Who are they? My uncles and others who were in the inner circle before Voldemort's death. Draco approached the edge of his desk, leaning on it. The power structure within the Death Eaters is an oligarchy, much like the Ministry now, with the Wizengamot controlling all of the actions of the Minister. They won't follow one person, as they believe having a lone leader will end up with skewed and selfish motivations. Hermione nodded along, processing the information, like Voldemort's hyperfixation on killing Harry and immortality. I don't remember them being very smart. Harry scratched the back of his head. At least not smart enough to coordinate an attack like the one on St. Mungo's. Neither do I, but while the element of surprise was inspired, there was little rhyme or reason in the attack as a whole. We couldn't figure out the purpose. Theo's office was untouched. Potter thought it was you, and perhaps that was Greyback's goal when he realized you were there, but nothing else about it made sense. Hermione yawned suddenly. Harry chuckled. Appears the meeting is over for the day. No, I'm fine. Go get some air. The edge in Draco's tone left no room for argument. We'll come back to this. Standing took both effort and help in the form of Draco's offered hand. He lingered after Percy and Harry left, and with an even expression, he looked her over before he stepped closer. Why are you in a sling? Susan thinks it'll help. How's your head? It's fine. I'm fine. And it was true. With a nod, Draco excused himself, likely to finish up whatever they were doing with the map in his office. Hermione spotted Catherine in the kitchen with Zippy before returning to the outdoors. Blaise stood watch by the doorway, arms folded and eyes glued to where Padma was seated on the blanket with Albus and Scorpius. The sight was wholesome, with bits of Albus' constant chatter flittering over to where they stood. He was going on about starting lessons with Scorpius next week, and how excited he was for it. But what warmed her heart was watching Scorpius, who was sitting next to Padma, reach over and smooth the space between her eyebrows with his thumb. Padma grinned. Blaise simply observed, and the corners of his mouth twitched before a small chuckle escaped. For a moment, Hermione wasn't sure if he noticed her at all. He seemed lost in thought, focused on his fiancée as she smiled at the boy and talked to them both. Hermione's question escaped before she could hold it back. How are you doing with all this? Me? What about you? His dark eyes cut to her. Truth. It's not easy. Hermione tried to roll the tension out of one shoulder. You? One day at a time. His gaze returned to the sight before them. We found out yesterday that her migraines are likely permanent, as is the scar. Padma's strong and dedicated to her work, so she's been quiet about what that could possibly mean for her career. Padma hadn't told her that, likely due to her own fears about permanent injuries. What she doesn't understand is that her scar is a reminder of how strong she is. I'd rather it be permanent than the alternative. Blaise offered his hand for her to shake in an abrupt move that left her momentarily speechless. Everyone tells me I have you to thank for that. Don't thank me. I couldn't leave her like that. Hermione shuddered at the memory of the deal she'd made with the devil to keep her friend safe. I would have made the same decision again, even with the same outcome. I'll thank you anyway. They stood in silence that was weighted, yet comfortable. Hermione hadn't spent much time with Blaise beyond him delivering ingredients to her house, and little odd conversations over the years. She barely knew him outside of what she'd observed and been told, so it was quite easy to leave the quiet undisturbed as they watched Padma, but unnatural for it to sit for too long. Apparently Blaise agreed. I need another favor from you. Hermione toyed with the ends of her braid. What is it? I need to borrow your greenhouse. Blaise slid both hands into the pockets of his trousers. I know Padma. She'll want to postpone the wedding, and I refuse to. The determination in his voice held a different tone, but sounded familiar. I proposed again this morning, and I'll keep doing it until I can make good on my word, preferably in 2 weeks, when you're both cleared for magical travel. We'll still have the wedding in February, but this will be for the both of you. Not their families, not anyone. Exactly. His eyes slid over to her. And since you're doing me a favor, I'll do you one as well. I don't need anything. I thought Draco was evasive about you for his own sake, but I realize it's for yours. Hermione froze like a statue, and her mouth went dry. All she could do was blink and think and wait. Whatever choice you make about him, make it once and completely. Paralyzed with the sick sensation of drowning in her own blood, Hermione woke up gasping for air. She shut her eyes and reoriented herself to reality and the bed she'd wound up in alone. Too restless to wait, Hermione dragged herself out of bed, stepped into her slippers, and made the slow walk to the kitchen for water before continuing on towards the light at the end of the hall. Draco stood alone, peering down at the map on the table. It's late. Focused on his task, her words seemed to startle him, and gray eyes cut in her direction. You were asleep. No longer wearing her sling, Hermione held her injured arm close to her body and used the other to fix the shoulder of the shirt she was swimming in. I woke up. They both knew why. I was just finishing up. Hermione joined him at the small table, taking in the sight of the map that she'd only gotten a glimpse at earlier. There were 8 swirling diamonds. What is it? Letters, on the ores we planted. Is this how you... Yes, in a way. He sounded detached and clinical, eyes so distant she wondered if he was occluding, but she hoped he wasn't. Draco pointed at a diamond. Each note is attached to a diamond. Because there are so many, I use the map when I need to see the location of more than one. The beacon spell lasts 30 days, so most were on the move, or still at the hospital when I activated the spell. I picked the ones that were still. Draco raised his hand and summoned a diamond from his desk. He placed it on the edge of the map and whispered a spell to make it glow like the others and move automatically. It stopped in the Forest of Dean, far, far from home. The first stationary note led me to where you'd been splinched. He'd found pieces of her first. Eventually, I made it to the last stationary spot. You had 2 on you. I left one buried to find it again so I could bring the team to investigate the area. The other was in his pocket, stained with her blood, Hermione remembered. I created a port key and brought you to the hospital. How long did it take? Not long, or you would have bled out. Draco's jaw clenched. It was close. Too close. Hermione didn't push, feeling his resistance and remembering Susan's words. Are you coming to bed? It was a question she asked each night, but his answer remained the same. They left the diamonds floating above the map. Hermione waited by her bedroom door until she heard 2 knocks before opening it. Draco's hair was still wet from his shower. His chest was bare, shirt slung over his shoulder, leaving his tattoo visible. She let him in. She said nothing and kept her eyes trained on the dragon while he spread the minty balm on her forming scars and irritated skin. Draco's face was always blank while he worked, inexpressive when he pulled her shirt back down, except when something unreadable flashed across his features as he touched the remaining marks on her neck. It's almost gone. I know. Draco slept on his side facing the door. It was his way, on the lookout even in his own home. And Hermione began each night facing him, on the edge of her pillow, tracing flames with a single finger. They both ignored the tremor until it worsened. His hand entwined with hers and held on, bringing their joined hands between them. "What woke you?" Draco's murmured question was loud in the quiet surrounding them. "I dreamed I was drowning." She watched him, still tense under the weight of her nightmares. She shifted closer. "What keeps you awake?" "Thoughts. Memories. You." Hermione tensed but kept her eyes on him. Dense and gray, his eyes were like a storm over the sea. Tumultuous, untamable, and completely indifferent to the whims of mankind. Nothing to do except wait it out. But that didn't stop Hermione from trying to temper the heavens. "Have you talked about finding me?" I have." Draco took a deep and shaky breath, and it mirrored the relief she felt. "A few times, but I don't want to talk about that tonight." "What do you want to talk about?" Often Draco said little to nothing, but sometimes he waited until she was on the brink of sleep before he spoke. Sometimes they discussed things she already knew, or things she'd been curious about but never asked. But mostly he told her things he never spoke of. Preferences mainly, but he also gave her glimpses of his past and little bits of information that rounded out his character. "Do you travel?" Hermione hadn't expected the question. "My parents travel often, but I haven't in years." "Sometimes I miss France." Draco was slow to continue after his confession. "Have you been?" "Not in a long time, but I wouldn't mind being a tourist again." "France is more than the museums and landmarks, more than books and travel guides. Paris isn't bad, but I prefer the mountains. We have a home in Chamonix. My mother hates." "I can take you." Draco shifted, but his focus remained on her in that cautious way of his. "You and Scorpius in winter." Before Hermione could answer or even process the idea of making plans, a stab of pain made her calf spasm, and she punched out a grunt. The phantom pain was back, and it made him retreat but not leave. Hermione blinked at the ceiling, trying to muddle through until the spell was over, but her muscles tensed more. It felt like a memory, like agony, like being split apart all over again. Nausea rose and her heart thundered in her chest as she tried to catch her breath. She didn't want to panic, not now, but it wouldn't be tamed. Hermione wasn't sure when Draco moved, but he was there with a vial that she accepted. Not needing to be told what it was, she drank it knowing it would relieve the pain. Draco massaged her leg and focused on his task, mouth downturned. She felt better in minutes instead of hours. Turning on her side, the pain potion began to work, lulling her eyes shut. Draco molded himself to her back, and her appreciation was given quietly when she tightened her hold on their joined hands. Sleep came easy with the steady beat of his heart against her back. Hermione woke up alone. Looking to the window, Hermione found her bearings, only to discover that it was still dark. Then she glanced at the clock on her bedside. It was just after 3. She had a feeling where he might be. The walk was short, but confirmation was soon found when she peeked her head into the open door and spotted something that made her lean on the doorway. The ceiling was covered in stars from a projector that had been pulled out when Scorpius' sleep troubles started last week. Beautiful and calming. But Hermione's eyes didn't stay there long, drawn instead to Draco dozing on his son's bed, but not quite asleep. He didn't look comfortable, curled on his side, arm extended, neck turned in a way that would hurt later. But Draco didn't seem to care. His attention was on Scorpius, who had his head on his father's arm and his thumb in his mouth, sleeping peacefully while buried in Hermione's blanket. The only things sticking out of the blanket were his face, feet, and an arm that was stretched out, fingers firmly wrapped around his. "I should talk to you more." Draco's murmured words startled Hermione, but it wasn't directed at her, only Scorpius. "You do." Her response announced her presence, but he only looked up. "But if you're looking for other things, tell him a story about you. A secret. He'll listen regardless because he wants to. He's interested. Use your history as a lesson, not a threat." "Has he talked about—" Draco shook his head. "Never mind." From his cocoon, Scorpius made a soft, sleepy noise that momentarily distracted them both. Draco looked perplexed in a way that made her smile. then more when he slowly extracted himself from his son's grip and eased his body out of the bed. Hermione walked around it, removing the bed as a divider, and glanced up at him the moment he scrubbed a hand over his face. "Tired?" "No." Hermione pulled him away. "What do you do when you can't sleep?" "Laps." The look Draco gave her was endless, but I'm only allowed 2. Hermione changed into her swimsuit and slipped into the pool room in time to observe his allowed laps. The sound of moving water was soothing, and Draco was just as graceful in the water as he was on dry land. When she was comfortably seated on the edge, her legs in the water, he dipped beneath the surface in the center of the pool and swam to her. His hands emerged first, before the rest of him followed. Draco wiped the excess water from his face and shook his hair. "Feel better?" "Yes." Draco glanced down at her legs. "Getting in?" "I'm supposed to take a break from exercises." "I know." She joined him anyway, submerging herself completely and resurfacing. Hermione wasn't a strong swimmer, and it didn't take much for her to tire from merely keeping herself afloat. It was hard to tell how they ended up in the middle of the pool with her wrapped around him and his hands firmly on her bum, but there they were, neck deep in water and entwined. "How's your shoulder?" "Improving." "Are you tired yet?" "No." A bead of water ran down his face to the corner of his mouth. Rather than fight the urge, Hermione leaned into it, first testing his upper lip, then his lower. Less exploratory and not quite demanding, her kiss was straightforward. An experience and taste that was slightly different, more familiar. Their lips parted with ease as her tongue snaked along the bottom lip before pulling back just a fraction. Eyes open and locked on each other. They drifted closer to the wall without her noticing. Time passed, but Hermione was unaware of how much. It could have been seconds, or minutes, or hours. She didn't know. Draco was quiet, giving her the same look he often did, deeper than the pool they were in. Water lapped against their skin as he shifted her in his arms. Hermione frowned, but Draco huffed an amused noise. "You're not heavy, but you're under strict orders not to exert yourself. Nothing strenuous, physical, or stressful. Those 3 came in all forms, bad and very good." The implication of want was loud but deafened by his patience. Draco leaned in again, and Hermione sucked in a breath, quick but harsh, and tightened her arms around his neck. "No rush." His lips brushed against hers, and his quiet words drew her in. "For now, this will do." His mouth was on hers again, and surrendering was as natural as the trust she put in him, with each word. As easy as each night they opened up to each other through snatches of conversation before falling asleep. Engrossed in the moment, they floated on. And on. Draco never let her go. October 9th, 2011. Morning rain had left everything damp. The sky was overcast, threatening more rain, but the clouds held the sky at bay long enough for her to step out the front door and look back where Scorpius was at his dad's side. He wanted to come with them, but Draco had whispered something in his ear that made his mood brighten. A secret. One Hermione wasn't privy to until a familiar car pulled into the drive and an even more familiar person emerged. Her dad. She took an unconscious step towards him, then looked back and tilted her head curiously. "We'll meet you there." Hermione's eyebrow rose. "Where?" "Enjoy the ride, Granger." Draco just nodded in her dad's direction and closed the door. All feelings of puzzlement evaporated when she hugged her father, but returned when they were pulling away from the Malfoys' house. "Where are we going?" "Don't worry, I know the way." Leaving London was a nightmare by car, and traffic served as a reminder of the joys of magical transportation. Her dad didn't seem fazed. He had the radio on, hands on the wheel, and rather than being drawn to the streets they navigated, she was more focused on him. Once they were on the open road, with the countryside ahead and the city at their backs, Hermione felt settled enough to speak. "You didn't tell me you were coming." They'd talked for nearly an hour on the phone that had appeared in the guest room last week. "It was a surprise." Her dad snuck a quick glance at her. "How are you feeling? Even with the sling, you look better. Stronger." "In some ways I am." Hermione took a deep breath. "In others, I'm not. Are you and Mom still in the safe house?" We were allowed to return home yesterday evening, but we have Aurors watching our house in addition to all the magic you warded it with. I didn't know you'd done all that." "I did it a long time ago. Years, actually, to keep you both safe." "Ron told us of what's been going on. With the werewolf, the attacks, the Death Eaters. I had no idea." "I never wanted you both involved. It's why I charmed your memories. Never mind." Her dad said nothing until the beginning of the next hour. Where were they going? "You're like me in that aspect, you know?" She looked at him. "What?" "I start a lot of sentences that I'm afraid to finish." He tapped his finger on the steering wheel before turning the music off. "I put things away to talk about later, or even think about later. And the next thing I know, years have passed, and my daughter looks at me like she's not even sure who I am." Hermione stopped breathing. "And I find myself unsure of who she is." Choked up, she could only look at the greenery that hadn't changed with the season just yet. "And I spend years in the same room once a month trying to speak, but not finding the words." Her hands went to her chest, flattening over her wildly racing heart. "It's a never-ending cycle that I want to break." Finally, her emotions released their grip long enough for her to speak. "I do too. Hermione took a breath. "I can't remember a time when I didn't miss you. I should have said something sooner." "I should have too." Tears escaped and she let them fall. Catharsis was found in release and healing, and enabling seeds of recognition to be sown. "I'm not sure if we'll get back to where we were before, but I understand more than ever why you altered our memories. Ron told us everything. Everything that happened during that year that you didn't want us to know. I'm glad I never knew the danger you were in. I would have been worried sick. But why didn't you tell us after?" "Mom was so upset the moment she remembered, and I just didn't think detailed explanations would make anything better. It was easier to try and move on, atone and cope." Her dad reached over and took her hand, and squeezed gently when it trembled. "We might not understand your world, but we are your parents. I think a lot of your mother's issues came from feeling obsolete in your life, cut out and helpless. Sometimes I feel that way too." Though his eyes were trained on the road, they were wet like hers. "You're our only child, Hermione. We've watched you grow and change, and have always been proud of you, even if we don't understand the world you live in. Always." Fresh, hot tears continued staining her cheeks red. Hermione sniffed, listened, and breathed. "It's instinct for us to want to protect you, even when it's clear we don't know how, even when it hurts that we can't." Hermione understood but remained quiet, shifting in her seat and leaning against his arm while he changed gears and continued driving through the English countryside. Green and serene, calming and quiet. Another hour passed before he spoke again. "How your mother has handled this has been a point of contention, but that's between you two. I don't want to dredge it up, not today at least. My fault lies in not taking the time to see your world." She sat up when he began to slow, "which is what I intend to rectify today." It was right then that Hermione realized they weren't just on a ride, when she noticed exactly where they were, what she'd been too distracted by the conversation to process. They were home, specifically at hers. When they pulled into the grass, her father turned off the car and looked around before wordlessly getting out and walking to the front of the car. She joined him as he looked around at the sprawling green pasture that's surrounding her home and led to the mix of colors in the forest. The scent of evergreen was thick in the air. Only 2 weeks had passed, but the land looked different. The trees had turned more. "You live here?" He never let her respond. "It's peaceful." Peace that was constantly under threat but worth the fight. "Would you like a tour?" Her question seemed to startle him. Yes." The walk to her front door was silent. Hermione watched as her dad looked around, catching sight of the stream, the sparse trees out front, and the house itself. But before she could open the door, the knob twisted and opened for her. There was Draco with Scorpius at his side, dressed in a different green jumper that protected him from the chill. "What are you—" Then she remembered. "We'll see you there." "Dad, this is—" "We've met." Draco extended a hand. "Mr. Granger, always a pleasure." "Mr. Malfoy." The handshake was formal but firm. and then he glanced down at Scorpius, whose smile came easier when he peered up at him. "And who might you be?" "This is my son, Scorpius." Her dad went to stoop before him, and Hermione almost stopped him because it took time for Scorpius to warm up to anyone. But the little boy surprised her by only scrutinizing him for mere seconds before accepting his hand. Slowly, tentatively. "I'm Hermione's dad." Scorpius looked curious, intrigued even. The tour was quiet. Draco vanished while Scorpius lingered at her side with his hand in hers. They started in the office, which was clean even though she knew she hadn't left it like that. Her dad walked around her brewing room in a way that reminded her of the last person to navigate the space, the same person who was currently in the storage closet putting ingredients away. "I just finished before Catherine delivered Scorpius prior to your arrival." "Finished what?" Draco's response was a long look that sent Hermione on her way with a chuffed eye roll. Her dad looked back once, but said nothing. He kept walking. By the time they made it to the living area, Scorpius was freely leading the way to his favorite space, the conservatory. Her dad froze mid-step upon entering the room, then continued in, looking around in renewed awe. As she did when Scorpius picked up on the rehab plants that was looking much improved and showed it to both of them. Then another plant, and another, before taking him on a tour of the potted conservatory garden while she remained by the door. Bits of her dad's comments and compliments filtered to her ears, but she would have thought it was his platitudes given to a child to feign interest if he hadn't looked amazed. Hermione looked on, watching Scorpius warm with her dad's growing interest. Hands on her shoulders made her jolt, then relax back against Draco's chest. "How was your ride?" "It was nice. Nice to get out and see the countryside in autumn. Nice to talk to her dad. Nice to feel like the loose strings between them were finally weaving together." "Thank you for arranging this. What did you say to get him to come here?" "I didn't say anything." The next hour passed both slowly and quickly as the tour continued, not just for him, but for her as well. All was well. The chickens were healthy and happy, and the plants were clearly cared for. Her friends had taken care of everything. Humbled and gracious, even more with the addition of her father, Hermione found herself quieter than usual. Seeing him there, in her world, in her life, in her home, left her full to the brim with emotions that threatened to spill over. The mood carried her through the lunch that Draco had clearly purchased, and continued after when they settled on the sofa, and Scorpius returned with something to keep him entertained, a coloring book. It wasn't long before he had his own marker holder. She looked over at Draco, but found the space beside her in the kitchen empty. Frowning, she wandered to where she thought he might be, the brewing room, and there he was, peeking at the cauldron along the wall. Hermione cleared her throat. "What are you working on?" Draco didn't turn around. "My mother's experimental potion." After washing her hands and drying them on a towel, she joined him at the table he'd cleared to give himself the space needed to calculate. Draco was tapping the pen against his chin as he looked over the changes he'd made to his equations with a concentrated frown. His glasses had slid down his nose slightly, and he broke from one action to adjust them before returning. She sat in the chair next to him, their legs touching. "It's important that the silphium balances with the other ingredients, but there's a specific way that it should be added. I read that—" Draco stopped abruptly. "What?" "You used a book to brew." "I did." His chuckle was deep in his chest, but Hermione heard it and flushed. "I never said I didn't, only that I had opinions due to you exclusively brewing from books. It'll take a week before we'll know if it works." And then there was the matter of testing its potency before introducing it to Narcissa's regimen, an uphill climb. "We're supposed to be relaxing." She drew him away. "Let's go." Scorpius wanted to show her father the greenhouse. The walk was quiet but short. Side by side, their steps synced as they walked behind Scorpius and her dad. Hermione swore she could feel the heat from his body when their arms brushed. Despite the crispness in the air, it was nice out. The sun was tucked behind the invading clouds, but blue skies were mostly winning their battle for control. The fight would undoubtedly continue on, and per the forecast, the clouds would win the war in the end. Draco held the door of the greenhouse open, and instead of fuss, she walked in, basking in the immediate change in temperature. Hermione snuck glances at Draco, picking up on the small signs that he was too warm. The barest tint on his ears, the way he kept moving his glasses up as Hermione gave her dad the tour. There were far more plants than she remembered. One of the empty tables was now full, and there was an array of small, flowering trees that had taken a place in the center. "What is this?" Her dad gestured to what looked like a pot full of soil. "I'm not sure," but Scorpius knew, as did Draco. "Scorpius planted your seeds last week with Longbottom." The look he gave her was proud, but he kept insistently staring at his father, then poked him on the forearm until Draco gave a begrudging huff. "I helped." The visual of Scorpius and Draco planting her daylily with Neville's help was unfathomable, yet the image played vividly in her mind. Hermione couldn't help but grin. "I can't wait to see it." She and Draco exchanged looks that held for so long neither of them noticed her dad and Scorpius had moved on. "What is this?" Her dad was looking at the pot of silphium. "It's an extinct plant. My friend Neville is working to cultivate plants that haven't existed in nature in years. We're using it for a potion for Draco's mother." "She's your patient, correct? The one we went to the library for?" "Yes." She watched her dad pick up the pot Neville had carefully separated from the rest. For some reason, Hermione kept nervously talking, especially when he kept looking at the plant. What was he expecting to see? "All the soil types are different, but the idea was to charm each plant to maintain what the temperature might have been when it existed in nature. Any signs of growth, like buds, perhaps?" Hermione frowned. "Exactly." "Well, look at this." They all approached him, even Scorpius. "Do you see it?" "See what?" "Look." And when Hermione did, it took several passes to see what her father saw. 2 new buds. Small, barely noticeable, but alive, growing. There was something special about new life, something intangible that made it magical. It was a fresh start, a new chapter, a beginning to a journey like no other. But it was also something more, something that each needed in their own way. Hope. Sunset was nearly finished when Scorpius nodded off with his head in her lap. Draco took him inside to lay him on the sofa, and her father watched him go, waiting until the door to the conservatory shut before looking at her. He looked vaguely amused. "He's an interesting man." "That he is." "Like still waters, silent men are deep and dangerous." That was quite the statement coming from her father, but not unwholly untrue. Draco was still an enigma, a riddle yet to be solved, but the questions that now lingered were different than before. In the last 2 weeks he'd spoken more, but also not given much away. There were their normal conversations over morning tea, snatches of exchanges throughout the day, and the little talks before bed. Not much in the grand scheme of things, not even as long as their first when he showed her the dragon she saw every night. But Hermione couldn't remember ever talking to someone that much, or listening to each syllable, lest she missed something important. She cared about the crumbs of information offered in low whispers when they were both on the edges of sleep. She'd learned more about the sweet tooth he hardly indulged in, and that he'd only started wearing glasses last year when more than a decade of reading in low light, and the fact that he didn't care for cardamom. Draco didn't hate the color red as much as he disliked orange, but when she told him her favorite was green, he said he knew and kissed her before she could ask how. Which led her to a new topic. Draco kissed her once a day, every day, in different locations and at different times, and Hermione couldn't remember kissing someone so much or so often either. Yet she still wanted more. She couldn't remember ever being simultaneously calmed and stirred by someone's touch and presence, or having the desire to be around a person so unconsciously. Easy to rationalize, it was harder to digest her own reasoning. Hermione had slept alone for years, and she thought she preferred it that way, but now she found herself briefly wondering if she could again. Was waking up each morning to Draco something she could give up when she returned home? The thought alone paralyzed her. "You look like you're at war." "I am," Hermione sighed. "I have been. More and more since she'd had so much time to think about everything. The age-old problem of thinking while immersed reared its head. And there was that battle between her head and her heart. You know, he turned up at the safe house with a note that had a date, time, and 2 addresses, yours and his, followed by instructions. He gave it to me and left without saying anything. That sounded like Draco. It also explained his comment about not having to ask her father to come. He simply gave him an option and let him decide. The concept was as familiar as coordinating breakfast times for a father to begin bonding with his son. Hermione looked down. The parallels couldn't be ignored. Both were fathers trying to understand their children, trying to bond with them, speak to them, and reach for them. And they had been steadily doing so in their own ways. They had both needed a little help in the end to get there, but they were trying, working, and putting forth the effort. It took 2 hours to decipher what his note said. A laugh bubbled in her chest before it simmered into a soft smile. Draco's handwriting is horrid. Scorpius still can't read it, and it took me a while to learn how. Now she could read his notes without squinting, a testament to how far they'd come. Speaking of, Scorpius is the quietest child I've ever met. He stopped speaking when his mother died last November, but he's finding his voice again. He'd probably said 30 collective words to Hermione since the first. That morning he'd said, "Good morning," instead of signing it, and was careful in making sure no one else was around. Still so shy. He took to you easier than I've seen him take to most adults. I think that had to do with the fact that I'm your dad. He paused. He's intrigued by you. I mentioned that at his age you easily entertained yourself like he does, and he seemed to want to know more. I told him about your first trip to the library and even to the zoo, and he was fascinated. Hermione was surprised. For months she'd been talking to him, helping him open up and figure out all his cues and clues, but meanwhile he just wanted to know her. I had no idea. But now that she did, she would do better. Her dad chuckled. Also, I couldn't help but notice he has a loose tooth next to the one growing in. Forever a dentist. Another one? Scorpius was not happy about losing his first. I'd pay good money to see his father handle that. Hermione joined in when he laughed. If anything, it'll be like the first. A staring contest with an irritated child and a lot of open cabinets and drawers. Ah, that sounds familiar. Her smile widened, and she placed a hand on top of his, resting her head on his shoulder. Thank you for coming, Dad. It means a lot that you're here. Thank you for letting me. Their hands stayed like that for a while, tremor and all. If you'll let me, I'd like to come back. It's a long drive, but well worth it. When you lose control, you discover new things. Daniel Lenoir.